As central bank digital currencies gain steam in the public sphere and the potential horrific implications for privacy become more well understood, I thought it was a good time to do today's video, which is a dive into the state of privacy of the Bitcoin Lightning Network. Is it a panacea for privacy, as some proponents claim, or is there more to this story that we need to be aware of and working against? Today we find out. Let's jump in. Welcome back to another video. My name is Ian Major. I'm an entrepreneur, Bitcoin pleb, and all-around raging capitalist. I've had this video on my docket for quite some time now. Feels somewhat like a good time to go ahead and do it. And it is really to take a more careful look at both the merits and potential drawbacks as it relates to privacy and fungibility of Bitcoin on the Lightning Network. Because I still see wild extremes on this topic. On the one hand, you have Bitcoiners that have, drank the Kool-Aid of some influencer that they listen to and think the Lightning Network is this perfect solution for all privacy. And it is as simple as using it and you're suddenly bestowed with magical privacy powers. This is wildly untrue. But then on the other side, you have what we might call on-chain maximalists who, scoff at the Lightning Network, think it's a scam, and have this sort of defeatist attitude that it can never be improved and that, privacy is just going to remain elusive. And so I'm going to go and use Monero, right? And so as with many complex topics, the truth is somewhere in between. But where exactly is it? Today we're going to find out. So you're not going to want to miss a thing. For those returning to the channel, welcome back, my friends. As always, it is a pleasure to have you. And for those new to the channel, I welcome you as well. If you like this type of content, I invite you to consider subscribing and join us in our growing merry gang in cyberspace. I cover all manner of Bitcoin-related content, including a whole slew of tutorials on how to acquire Bitcoin, secure it, privacy best practices, running your own node, the Lightning Network, and little deep dives like today's video. You want it, I cover it. That is how this works. But with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to do a very brief refresher on how the Lightning Network actually works. Then we are going to get into the privacy benefits as well as some of the potential risks and mitigation efforts that are underway to address this. All right, so I have done entire videos on how the Lightning Network works, so I'm going to throw that up on the screen now for you to take a look at. If you are a little bit newer to all of this, I would definitely recommend checking that out. I'll also put the link to that and to an entire Lightning related playlist in the description down below. But in essence, recall that the whole purpose of the Lightning Network is really around instant settlement, right? It was not necessarily designed to bestow amazing privacy guarantees, which are of course also somewhat absent on the base layer itself. However, we need to remember that fungibility is a critical property of money. And given my belief and the belief of others that the Lightning Network is by far the most viable method of making Bitcoin a true medium of exchange, this is a really important topic. But in a nutshell, how this works is that an initializing funding transaction will lock some Bitcoin in a 2-of-2 multisig that forms what is called a payment channel between two nodes on the Lightning Network. And the way this works is somewhat like having a tab open with a friend. Within that payment channel, any number of payments can be conducted back and forth, and none of those are broadcast to the Bitcoin blockchain itself. And at some point in the future, either party can choose to close that channel, which settles the balance to the respective owners, depending on what the channel state is at that point in time. And then the way you create a network out of these payment channels is through the concept of payment routing. And so in our handy diagram here, we can see, maybe Alice wants to pay Carol half a Bitcoin over Lightning, and she has a channel open with Bob that has a capacity of 1 Bitcoin. And Bob has a channel open with Carol that has a capacity of 1 Bitcoin. And so Alice can route her 0.5 Bitcoin payment through Bob to Carol. And it's kind of like beads moving along an abacus, right? Alice would push some of her balance over to Bob, who would then push some of his balance over to Carol. Now, there's related concepts within that called outbound and inbound capacity. That means how much capacity do I have to send to my channel partner versus how much can I actually receive. I've talked about all of those concepts in other videos. And so ultimately with this setup, transactions can happen within these created payment channels, this sort of sea of two of two multi-sigs, and routing can happen trustlessly. Let's say that I'm actually not sending it to Carol, but Daryl, like I don't even have to know who the hell Carol is. If Carol has a channel with Daryl, my payment, provided that the transaction is well formed and adheres to the rules of the network, and that there is sufficient capacity along that route and a valid route can be found, then that payment is going to be able to make it. So let's talk about some of the privacy benefits that such a system confers. For one, and we sort of said it already, is that all these payments are not being broadcast to the actual blockchain, other than the funding transaction, which opens that payment channel initially, and any closing channel transactions that would close the channel out and settle the balances to the respective owners. Those are the only two fingerprints, if you will, that would be broadcast and settled onto the actual Bitcoin blockchain. Furthermore, with the onion routing concept and these kind of multi-hop payments that we just illustrated, what's nice is that each node only knows the immediately next destination. So they don't necessarily know the final destination where the payment is destined for. And furthermore, each point along that chain doesn't even know who the original sender was. So that's very, very good for sender privacy. But as we will discuss later, receivers, not so much, depending on how the invoice was created for this payment. The other consideration is that you do have the option to run a Lightning node as Tor only. So you can either run a node that is IP-based or Tor-based. And a lot of the popular node implementations, such as Raspberry Blitz, Umbrel, actually do Tor only by default. And so that is why when you're sharing, for example, a public key with a friend who wants to open a channel with you, that's why you'll see the kind of onion portion at the end of your pub key when you copy that out of something like Umbrel. And having this option is really key. If privacy is really important to you, you definitely want to be running a Tor only node, because otherwise your IP address can get revealed, and through that IP address, folks can potentially locate you at least roughly geographically, right? There's a lot of information that an IP address can potentially reveal depending on the circumstances. There is also an option to create what are called private channels, which really can be thought of as unannounced channels. So you're opening a channel with some peer on the network, and that is not going to be broadly knowable to the rest of the network. While this is good in some regards, it has a lot of caveats actually, as we will soon discuss. So you may be thinking, okay, well that sounds pretty good, right? Like, all these little payments happening that are not being broadcast on the main chain. That's awesome. Nodes routing this don't necessarily know my final destination as a sender. That sounds great. So what's the catch? Let's go through some of the key themes, and I do want to give a shout out to these terrific articles that I am referencing in large part for today's video. This is a Medium article from Rafael Osaze-Ayeren. I hope I'm saying that correctly. As well as this post back in 2021 from Tony, who used to be quite active on Twitter as well, but is no longer. I will put both of these links in the description down below if you are curious to take a look and go into a little more detail. And what I'm going to try and do as we go through each of these themes is to also comment on some of the potential mitigation that you can do, if that is of concern to you. So number one, first and foremost, UTXOs or unspent transaction outputs. This is based on the accounting system that Bitcoin uses, where if I'm sending a transaction from myself to you, I take what are called UTXOs or unspent transaction outputs, and those become inputs into this transaction that I'm sending to you. And so what's happening when I'm opening a payment channel with another node is that I am locking up a UTXO or maybe part of a UTXO into this payment channel. Now, the good news in general is that what's publicly known is the channel capacity. That is the total channel capacity, not necessarily who has what portion of that total channel capacity, right? Like how much of that capacity is on my end, how much of that capacity is on the other individual's end. As we will discuss, attackers can probe that and try and deduce that. But at least by default, that is not sort of publicly known. But the problem is still that you can basically see this UTXO that is connected to this channel. And so you can know with a 50% chance that it belongs to either one of these nodes, right? And when you consider the fact that, well, maybe that UTXO came from, I don't know, Coinbase or from some KYC'd exchange, it becomes therefore more easy to say like, well, okay, there's a 50% chance that this UTXO belongs to Ian because Coinbase and others use all sorts of on-chain heuristics to track their users after they leave their exchanges. And furthermore, there's other ways to deduce this. For example, let's say that I open one payment channel with a portion of the UTXO that I have, and then I receive the balance or remainder of that UTXO as change. And let's say that I then use that change to open yet another payment channel. So let's say I have a Bitcoin, I've used half of it to open one payment channel, half of it to open another. It would not be that difficult for surveillors to determine with pretty high likelihood that, okay, like that particular node is who these UTXOs belong to. So the mitigation strategy here is to try and use a complete UTXO when you are opening a payment channel. And Tony also kind of hypothesizes that it's probably also a good practice to only have like one mixed UTXO on your Lightning node, right? The principle being the same when we talk about coin joining best practices, which is that once you mix coins into different UTXOs, you don't want to then recombine those UTXOs because you undo a lot of the privacy gains that you achieved in the process. And just for full clarity, let's look at this output, which is an example that shows you what is called this channel point. And so this is showing a channel that's been created between node 1 and node 2. And that channel point contains a UTXO index where you can basically see the UTXO details. And so the funding transaction and the UTXO context of that funding transaction are sort of embedded within the channel data, as it were. And you can furthermore see this channel ID that is used as part of invoices for routing. And so again, you know, if there's a node that's routing a transaction, you get the channel ID, you look up the channel ID, you can see the channel point, and get back to that kind of UTXO information. So again, try and use whole UTXOs when opening channels, and ideally use UTXOs that don't have your personal identity tied to it if you're trying to maximize your privacy. So let's now also talk about private channels and why they are not all that the name suggests. Going back to that point, right? If I have a private channel and I am trying to receive some Bitcoin over the Lightning Network via that private channel, and I create an invoice, I'm still encoding my channel ID as part of that invoice. And we can see an example of that here. Invoices contain quite a lot of information. You've got the public key of the node, you've got the short channel ID, you've got the amount that is being paid, and other information as well. So from that short channel ID as well as the public key, you can get to a lot of information, even for private channels. And so through that short channel ID, as we just illustrated, you can get to the UTXO context connected to that channel. So what is a mitigation effort here? It would be to have someone else open a channel with you. And there are services that provide just that. Assuming you want to receive Bitcoin privately through a private channel, that would be one good way to do so, is that you have someone else open the channel with you. Now, going back to that example of the data that's contained within an invoice, this speaks to another theme, which is just in general, receivers have quite poor privacy. The public key here can be used to understand your channels, UTXOs, whether you're Tor or IP based. And so for one, it should go without saying, but like, you know, if privacy is a concern of yours, don't post invoices publicly. Like if you're on Twitter, you see that a lot. You know, someone's like, post an invoice and I'll send you 100 sats. Like, that's fine if you don't care about privacy. Recognize that there's a lot of information embedded within that invoice if you're posting it in a public location. Now, again, this assumes you're running your own node and you're not using a custodial solution. And then ideally what you would love to do is to have a new public key associated with each invoice. This is quite similar to the best practice that you never want to reuse addresses when making on-chain transactions. This capability absolutely exists. Moon Wallet, M-U-U-N, I've done a whole tutorial on Moon Wallet if you want to check them out, actually does this by default and has been doing this for quite some time. I'm not exactly sure what the latest and greatest kind of tally of which wallets do this by default versus not. So if any of you know, do leave a comment down below because I think that would be helpful information for everyone. But do know that Moon Wallet does that by default. They basically rotate your public key per invoice which is a very, very nice privacy feature. Now, let's talk about sort of the final major theme or risk here. I mean, there are small others, but the final one I would highlight, at least in this video, is something called balance probing. And this is basically any manner of attack where some surveiller attempts to understand and build up a picture of how many funds sits on either side of a particular payment channel. What I mentioned earlier, which is that by default, what's publicly known is only the total channel capacity. So if the channel has 1 Bitcoin total capacity, maybe I only have 10 million sats and someone else has 90 million. And so what these balance probes are trying to do is route fake transactions with hash images that they know are going to fail. But the reason they're putting all these kind of fake requests through is to try and tease out how much balance sits on either side of the payment channel. So for example, if an attacker was to try and push 0.2 Bitcoin through me, well, that's going to fail, right? Because I only have 0.1 on my side, and then they can kind of lower until they identify that, that would have worked, although I gave, kind of a false hash image, and so payment's not actually going to go through. But now you've revealed information that tells me you have, 1.1 Bitcoin or less, and so I can therefore deduce that the other side of that balance is 0.9 because I know the total channel capacity is 1 Bitcoin. So as of now, this is currently a really, really difficult problem to solve. You could, in theory, loop funds in and out of your node. There is a tool called just that, Loop, on the Lightning Terminal app. I've done a video on that as well. You can find that in the Lightning Network playlist on this channel. But until something more significant changes, that is a tough one to mitigate. But on that note, let's now talk about some of the different efforts that are underway. You could go through that list and say, oh man, like fungibility, we're never going to get there. But there's a lot of different efforts that have both already been completed and are getting rolled out, or that are in development and could potentially take some time, but that I think are very much worth discussing. And so let's turn to that next. All right, so first and foremost, as adoption of Taproot increases, this will certainly help. As of today, about 90% of 2 of 2 multi-sig transactions are associated with the Lightning Network, right? Either the opening or closing of these 2 or 2 multi-sigs. So you can, with pretty high probability, inspect the blockchain, look for 2 of 2 multi-sig transactions and say, okay, these are probably related to the Lightning Network. So Taproot makes single and multi-sig transactions appear identical, at least in most cases that would be typical for the Lightning Network. You could have like a messy channel closing where there's unresolved outputs that would still probably show up as kind of detectable. But for the most part, this definitely helps. Now, Taproot has been rolled out by a number of different Bitcoin wallets and is generally supported quite broadly now. But, the actual level of adoption in terms of users using Taproot addresses is still quite low. So that'll change over time, similar to how native SegWit became the best practice. And then, over time, these things change. But it'll take a little bit of time, but that is definitely a help and a step in the right direction. There's also a number of different routing enhancements at varying levels of development, some that are quite advanced, some that are a little bit more nascent. One of the really exciting ones is something called rendezvous routing, and this promises to improve receiver privacy by having their public key and private channels concealed by including encrypted onion information within the invoice, as opposed to kind of what is done today. And this encrypted onion information would specify some random node that the sender should create a path to, from which the rest of the payment will be routed. So for example, even the sender in this case won't know the final destination. There's also something called trampoline routing, where a node sends a payment to a known trampoline router, which will then create the path to the destination. But again, they don't know if that's the final destination either. And this could be interesting for privacy, but also just, practically useful as you consider the fact that, as the Lightning Network grows and grows and grows, is pathfinding and the kind of gossiping protocol going to become unwieldy for low power nodes? Maybe, maybe not. That'll be interesting to see regardless. And then there's another concept called public key routing, which conceals the UTXO within the channel. While you could still technically detect a private channel between two peers, it would mask and hide the UTXO behind it, which is very cool. There's other potential enhancement, something called point time lock contracts, as opposed to the hash time lock contracts that sit at the core of Lightning Network routing today. This basically randomizes its identifier with each hop along the payment route, as opposed to using a static payment hash, which is what HTLCs use. There are multipath payments, so this exists today, or even better than that, atomic multipath payments, where you're splitting up a single payment and having portions of that payment take different routes to get to its ultimate destination. And each of those split up payments, in the case of atomic multipath, could have a different payment hash, etc. There's the idea of channel factories, which mostly is focused on scalability, i.e. there's of course very scarce block space on the base level main chain. And so there's always the analysis of like, if everyone on Earth were to want to open their own payment channel on the Lightning Network, you would have to take up all the block space for some incredible amount of time for that to happen. And so channel factories was something discussed as part of BIP 119. I did a video on that as well if you're curious to check that out. That is kind of sizzled down after some heated debate within the community. But in any way, the concept of channel factories is something that I think we'll see regardless. And while it's focused on scalability, it could also have some interesting properties for privacy when we draw analogy to how coin mixers work and kind of pooling funds together from different users. So a little bit remains to be seen there. Similarly, you could have some sort of zero knowledge channel concept. This has been spec'd out to some degree, although these presumably wouldn't support payment forwarding. So this would be probably most appropriate for kind of like a merchant to customer sort of interaction. And there are other major research efforts underway, such as Twilight, which comes out of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, around how do you create a kind of differentially private payment channel network. So again, lots and lots in development. I am encouraged that this is getting attention within the community. I think the attention that it should be getting is more than it is, but it's at least going in the right direction. So with all of that, let's go ahead and conclude today's video. So there you have it. We took a look at privacy on the Lightning Network and hopefully dispelled a few myths, right? It is neither the case that privacy is perfect on the Lightning Network, nor is it the case that no one cares, right? And nothing is being done about it. We talked about some of the merits that you do get, just baseline privacy gains relative to on-chain transactions. And I think that is true, but we did talk about what may seem like a rather long list of possible kind of surveillance attacks or just considerations of information that you might be leaving behind if you're not using it really carefully. And then we talked about some of the mitigation efforts, preserving as much of your privacy as possible. And if we're being honest, the conclusion there is that like this is pretty unwieldy. If you want to achieve like perfect level of privacy, that is really, really hard to do today on the Lightning Network. So let's at least acknowledge that reality and also embrace the fact that fungibility is a really important trait in money. And then similarly embrace the number of different development efforts that are underway to improve privacy and fungibility via the Lightning Network. So I remain wildly bullish on the Lightning Network and I'm really excited to see how some of these different efforts play out. But I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts? What do you think of both some of the pros and cons that we've discussed in this video? And are there other things I've missed that are coming down the pipeline that you're very excited to see? Let me know in the comments down below. But for now, we'll go ahead and leave this video here. I hope you found this valuable and insightful. If you did, you already know what to do. Give this video a like. Use the share feature underneath this video. That really does help get this in front of more people. And again, I think these are the types of conversations that are most important to be having. And if you got so much value from this content and you want to donate to a pleb, you can certainly do so through either my Strike account or my Lightning address that will both display on the end screen in just a moment. But for now, we'll go ahead and leave this here. As a reminder, my friends, every sat counts. And until next time, I'll see you then.